And welcome back to The Rock. And this is, of course, the day after South Africans went and made their mark. They cast their ballots. And as you can see there on the screen, that's the big screen here at The Rock, how the votes are coming in and those actual votes that have been cast for the various parties. And we are, of course, also reading through some of the numbers. And I must just indicate to you that at this stage, the counting as far as the votes to the provincial legislature, that's still quite low. That's still coming in. So not much of a prediction yet in that regard. But of course, for the National Assembly, the race for seats there, that picture seemingly a lot clearer because we've had a lot more of the vote coming through there. So still speaking to Professor Somadoda Fikeni, independent political analyst here with me, and we are trying to read through these numbers and exactly what they mean. And just perhaps a quick recap of where we are at. Counting progress, 15.58% of voting districts counted there, 1.27 spoiled ballots, the turnout 65.51%. And when we look at the national picture, what we're seeing at the moment, the ANC is at 53.15%, the DA 27.86%, EFF 7.62%, Freedom Front Plus 3.79%, and the IFP at 1.47%. And those are the top parties with 15.58% of voting districts counted. So once we look at that, I'm just going to call up here very quickly perhaps a comparison, and I'll come to that as it will load. It will take a moment to load as we look at what's actually happening with these parties across the provinces as well. But Professor, we were talking about the ANC and what this means for President Cyril Ramaphosa if the ANC indeed does lose that support. You were saying the ANC should be happy because it's perhaps not as brutal as it could have been, but of course there is still cause for concern.
Remember, this is probably the worst period for the ANC to go to the elections. All your dirty linen is being exposed in the commissions of inquiry, and you have the worst divisions within the leadership of the party playing itself out. You have the former leaders still being very active, jostling and sometimes contesting what is taking place. So this ought to have been the time of the worst vulnerability for the ANC, even in its effort to revive itself. That they survive gives them an opportunity to reform, to revive, but it will take the leadership being more decisive on the issue of people who have been involved in corruption, who had brought all the negativity and so forth. Of course, now they are being assisted by the judiciary, something which is beyond the political control of the ANC.
Is that a good strategy, though, for President Cyril Ramaphosa to embark on? Should you be looking at a legal solution to a political problem?
I think he has no choice, because if you have an NEC which is almost equally split, if you see his narrow margin of election victory in Nasrec, it is a political reality. And even worse, if the losing side is the one that is facing existential crisis in terms of the commissions of inquiry, in terms of what is coming out, it's going to be a lot more desperate. So he will have to mix both the political acumen and hope that the legal process does the rest.
Well, and that could be a very dangerous strategy to embark on. But if we're looking at the reality, so if we go with some of the predictions, and we must once again stress these are early predictions, but if we were to go with, for example, what the CSIR are predicting at this moment, again, we must put in the disclaimer, there will be a margin of error of about 2% to this. But at 17.28 million votes already counted there, and they are saying to us that if you look at what's happening with the 26.7 as well, the overall number of voters. So if you are looking at the margin of error 2% factored in, and the ANC is expected to lose more or less 20 seats in the National Assembly. And again, these are just predictions. These are not the actual numbers. We're talking predictions now. Let's say they lose even 10 seats in the National Assembly. It exacerbates the president's problems because now you have 10 more disgruntled people. that you have to deal with who may not be returning to the National Assembly. And that picture may be replicated within some of the provinces as well. How does the president deal with that? How does he absorb all of that pressure?
Actually, I wouldn't say it's his pressure per se, because they could easily explain that this is what has come out, this is the list, so it's not his problem. His main problem would be when you streamline the cabinet as it is expected to be streamlined. Who do you put in? Who do you leave out? And also his promise in the last Siyanqoba rally had been the people who are fingered in some of these will not see their way back to the cabinet or government positions. There was always a backdoor before where people were quietly taken into diplomatic postings. If he is true to that word, then you are likely going to have a lot more disgruntled senior leaders. There's also been a cry that some of the people have been ministers since 1994. You need a younger generation, you need more women. And that in itself would take a lot of suasion of leaders to say, can you step aside? If all they know has been to be deployed politically and they've never been involved in any other profession, it's worse than the 20 seats, the 10 seats in the National Parliament. Because there, he won't have to explain. He'll say, this is the list, the NEC approved the list, and there's been a decline. And since 2004, when the ANC reached its peak of almost 70%, they have been on an incremental decline, which means they've been shedding some seats in the National Assembly, and that in itself has weakened some of their portfolio committees, because if you are not fielding some of your best cadres, it means even if you have a smaller majority in a particular committee, the opposition can outwit, can outperform you if those members are not strong in the committees.
But how politically viable is that solution to the president's, future prospects within the ANC? Because let's get a few scenarios now. If we say that President Cyril Ramaphosa indeed follows through, makes good on his word, and those people who have been implicated, who are fingered in some sort of corruption or malfeasance are pushed to the side, how does that play out for him within the ANC and within the National Assembly?
But remember, there are many other variables. If the economy were to improve, if the investments were to be realized, if the employment rates were to improve, if corruption was to be reduced, it might over time give him space to consolidate.
On that point, you say that might give him time to consolidate. The reality right now is, on all the factors that you've just mentioned, none of them have actually delivered on the promise to date. There was talk of how many thousands of jobs, and we're not tracking that near the sort of levels that they wanted to take. But what does that mean for the president? Because yes, the economy, if it were to improve, would be a good boost for him and his presidency, but it's not improving. The jobs are not materializing. So where does he go from here?
But remember that what we often forget, the weakness of the president or the ANC does not automatically translate into the strength for the opposition. You might be having a situation where there is a crisis within the ANC, a crisis within the DA, a crisis in other parties, which simply means the relative strength of all of them. Because for the voter or for other people, they are saying, if this one is not working, what is the viable alternative?
And that is being borne out, at least in these early numbers that we are seeing, because we are seeing an ANC, in some cases, in some provinces, the picture is much clearer, where you can see the ANC's loss is perhaps the gain of an EFF, maybe a DA, but in other instances, it doesn't seem to translate into that, where you would see, for example, in one of the provinces that we looked at, where the DA has lost, and there seems to be a correlation, even at this early stage, with what they've lost and what the Freedom Front Plus is gaining. So there are many stories that are playing out with these results.
Precisely. What you are seeing is that the emotive issue of land and language might have led to the unification, the mobilization of the Afrikaner constituency around the Freedom Front Plus, because it was clearer on their messaging. The DA on the other side is trying to do two things: diversify by getting more black voters, put those blacks in leadership positions. That might discourage some of the career politicians who had come from the New National Party from elsewhere to the DA when they see that this looks like affirmative action taking place, and therefore they are likely to go back to the Freedom Front Plus. The other story within this bigger narrative, IFP might be gaining on the basis of the NFP declining, given the state of the leader of the NFP or the leadership. And also they might be gaining because some of the people might have voted for the ANC because the home of the president was in KZN. Now that he's no longer there, some people might be tracing their roots, the Kumbulikaya, they are going back to their parties.
So we are going to leave it there for the time being, but as the picture is emerging right now, it would seem as though a decline for the ANC, DA holding relatively steady at this point, and then the EFF gaining, the IFP gaining, the Freedom Front Plus gaining, and then you have ACDP hovering more or less about there, and Good, they seem to be coming into the national picture. But I said it's still a bit early to talk to those provincial numbers, but we will do so as soon as we can. All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, you'll be in Cape Town with Vanessa Puna.